gone to my place while I was at the hospital. I'd raced back to my apartment and found my front door ajar. Inside, my laptop was gone along with my external hard drive that contained backups of all my financial documents and passwords. The folder Garrett had given me was also missing from the coffee table where I'd left it. Natalie had been in my apartment and taken anything that could help me track her or prove her fraud. I'd called the police and filed a report, showing them the newspaper article on my phone.
I put this on camera.
The officer who responded had seemed skeptical at first, but had taken the report seriously when I'd explained about the attempted wire transfer and the missing laptop. The detective assigned to my case was a woman named Rita Faulkner, who'd worked fraud cases for 15 years. She'd listened to everything, looked through the photos of the newspaper articles I'd photographed before Natalie had stolen the folder, and had said she'd seen similar cases before. She'd said women like Natalie were difficult to prosecute because they were skilled at creating plausible deniability, and often disappeared before charges could be filed. She'd said my best chance of recovering...
I don't think he has an Alexa or a Mason on the stream Mason.
You can also use Brain FM for relaxation, meditation, even sleep. But don't take our word for it. Join millions of others and try it yourself for free. Let's see what you get done with Brain FM.
Alright, the Immortal Demon. Yeah, no.
Any money would be to press charges immediately and hope they could locate her before she left the state. I called Garrett and apologized, actually crying on the phone while I admitted he'd been right about everything. He'd been quiet for a moment before saying, "I'm coming over right now. Don't do anything until I get there." He'd arrived within 20 minutes and hugged me for the first time since we were teenagers. He'd said he'd been terrified I wouldn't believe him until it was too late, that he'd been losing sleep over watching Natalie destroy them, the way she'd destroyed those other men. He'd said the private investigator had found one of her previous victims who'd agreed to speak with us, a man named Philip Thornton, who'd been the first person quoted in the article about the Sacramento case. Garrett had called Philip while I listened. Philip had said Natalie had been the most convincing liar he'd ever met, that even after losing $300,000 to her, he'd almost believed her when she'd called crying and claiming there'd been a misunderstanding. He'd said she'd disappeared for 2 years after stealing from him, and he'd eventually given up trying to find her. He'd said if she was working the same scam on someone else, that person needed to protect their assets immediately because she'd take everything she could the moment she felt threatened. He'd said pressing charges was good, but recovery would be nearly impossible because she'd have the money hidden in accounts under different names. I'd asked Philip how he'd finally accepted the truth about her. He said it took him 6 months of therapy to process that the woman he loved had never actually existed, that every moment they'd shared had been a performance designed to manipulate him. He'd said the worst part wasn't losing the money, but losing his ability to trust his own judgment about people. He'd said he still had nightmares where she came back claiming to love him, and he had to wake himself up, remembering it was all lies. His voice had shaken when he told me to protect myself emotionally, because the betrayal would hurt worse than any financial loss. Detective Faulkner had called that evening saying they'd gotten a warrant for Natalie's arrest and were actively searching for her. She'd said Natalie's apartment had been completely cleared out, no furniture or personal belongings left behind. The apartment manager had said movers had come that morning and taken everything while Natalie supervised. She'd left her keys and disappeared. Her phone was going straight to voicemail, and her car wasn't at any of her known locations. Faulkner had said this matched the pattern of her previous disappearances, and they were checking bus stations, airports, and train stations.
He does not own my blue god. Oh my god!
Because I couldn't stand being in my apartment alone. We'd stayed up talking about all the signs I'd missed, all the moments that should have triggered suspicion. Garrett had said he'd first gotten suspicious during the engagement party, when he'd overheard Natalie asking details about my grandmother's name. He thought it was odd timing, given that my grandmother hadn't even passed away yet. He'd started paying attention after that, and noticed how Natalie steered conversations toward my finances and family wealth. He'd said most people didn't talk that much about inheritance and investment accounts during casual conversation. The next morning, I'd met with a lawyer recommended by my father. Her name was Diana Pacheco, and she specialized in fraud cases. She'd reviewed my and said I had a strong case for prosecution, but financial recovery would depend on whether they found Natalie and whether she still had access to any of protection now was to immediately alert all my financial institutions, change every password and security question, and monitor my credit reports daily for any fraudulent activity. She'd said women like Natalie often had accomplices who would continue attempting to access victim accounts even after the primary scammer disappeared. Diana had helped me
I've one secret base.
with all 3 credit bureaus.
That's
She
just
contacted the wedding vendors on my behalf, explaining that the wedding was canceled due to fraud, and that any payments supposedly made by Natalie Westbrook were likely fraudulent.
I don't even have a stash.
Funds for the small deposits I'd actually paid.
Well, this place is ruined. Ruined, bro. Because you give them orbitals.
Her intent to defraud me, the case went to trial, assuming they ever found her. 2 days later, my credit card company called about a suspicious charge. Someone had attempted to open a new credit card using my information and the billing address of a hotel in Las Vegas. The charge had been declined because of the fraud alert, but it confirmed Natalie was still actively trying to steal from me. Detective Faulkner had said this was actually good news because it gave them a location to focus their search. Las Vegas police had been notified and were checking hotels in the area where the card application originated. My parents had finally returned from their European vacation, where they'd been unreachable during the crisis. My mother had been horrified when I'd explained everything, and my father had been furious. He'd said he'd suspected something was off about how quickly the relationship had moved, but hadn't wanted to interfere in my personal life. He said he'd almost asked Garrett about his concerns, but had dismissed them as typical brotherly paranoia. My mother had apologized for not noticing the red flags, saying she'd been so happy I found someone that she'd ignored her own instincts about certain conversations with Natalie. The wedding date came and went. I'd spent it at home with my family, trying not to think about how I'd been 48 hours away from legally binding myself to a professional con artist. My grandmother's inheritance had been safely transferred to my accounts, which were now frozen pending the fraud investigation. Diana had said freezing everything was extreme but necessary until they knew the full extent of Natalie's scheme. She'd said some victims discovered their identities had been stolen and used to open dozens of fraudulent accounts.
Need an e-chest, bro. I have like everything in the world in my e-chest.
Las Vegas police had found her at a casino hotel using a fake ID.
All the police wanted to sleep with Quinn's girlfriend, Jennifer. They questioned his manhood.
The name Natalie Wade. She'd been arrested and was being held without bail due to the outstanding warrants from the states. Faulkner had said Natalie had initially denied it, but eventually admitted to the Sacramento and Seattle cases when confronted with evidence. She'd claimed my case was different because she'd genuinely fallen in love with me and had been planning to return the money after the wedding. Faulkner had said this was a common manipulation tactic and that Natalie had told similar stories to her previous victims. I'd asked if they'd recovered any of the stolen money, and Faulkner had said they'd found $38,000 in Natalie's possession, plus another $70,000 in bank accounts under various names. She'd said they were still tracking down the rest, and it was possible Natalie had accomplices who held additional money. She'd said financial recovery was unlikely, but they'd do their best to recover what they could. She warned that the legal process would take months or possibly years, and I shouldn't expect quick resolution. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. Diana had prepared me for what to expect, explaining that Natalie would likely plead not guilty and try to portray herself as a victim of circumstance or misunderstanding. She'd said Natalie's defense attorney would try to argue that the relationship had been genuine and that any financial irregularities were honest mistakes rather than intentional fraud. Diana had said my testimony would be crucial in establishing the pattern of deception and showing that Natalie had never intended to actually marry me, but had only been after my inheritance. I'd asked Diana how she could defend herself when there was clear evidence of her running the same scam on multiple men. Diana had said previous cases were used to prove guilt in my case without proper legal foundation, and that each case had to be proven on its own merits. She'd said the good news was that we had strong evidence, including the fake employment claims, the fake high-yield savings account, the attempted wire transfer, and her disappearance right before the wedding. She'd said the prosecution was confident they could prove beyond reasonable doubt that Natalie had defrauded me. Philip Thornton had agreed to testify about his experience with Natalie, as had David Nguyen from Seattle. Both men had traveled to meet with me and the prosecutor, sharing details about how Natalie had operated with them. The similarities were striking, down to specific phrases she'd used and stories she'd told. Philip said she'd told him the same story about growing up in foster care and changing her name to escape a troubled past. David said she'd used the identical excuse about wanting to combine finances before marriage to show commitment and trust. Hearing their stories was both validating and heartbreaking, knowing I'd been following the script she'd perfected for multiple victims. The prosecutor had been a veteran named Elizabeth Alvarez, who handled major fraud cases throughout her career. She'd met with me several times to prepare for trial, and had Garrett said our case was stronger than most because we'd caught Natalie before she'd successfully stolen the bulk of my inheritance. She'd said if I'd married her, Natalie would have been entitled to half my assets in a divorce, which would have made prosecution more complicated. She'd said Garrett's intervention had literally saved me from losing millions of dollars in years of legal battles. I'd visited Garrett the night before the hearing to thank him properly. He'd brushed off my gratitude, saying that's what brothers do for each other. I'd asked him why he'd been so suspicious of Natalie when everyone else had been charmed by her. He'd said he'd spent years in therapy working on his paranoia issues and had learned to distinguish between irrational anxiety and genuine warning signs. He'd said with Natalie, there had been too many inconsistencies in her stories, too much interest in my finances, too much pressure to speed up the relationship timeline. He'd said his instincts had been screaming that something was wrong even before he found the specific evidence. The hearing had been surreal. Seeing Natalie in court wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of the designer clothes she'd always worn, seeing her hands in handcuffs instead of holding mine, seeing her face expressionless instead of animated with the fake emotions she'd performed so convincingly. She'd glanced at me once when she'd entered the courtroom, and I'd seen something cold in her eyes, something that had always been there, but I'd been too infatuated to recognize. The woman I thought I'd loved had never existed. This stranger in handcuffs was the real person behind the mask. Natalie's defense attorney had argued that the relationship had been real and that financial complications didn't prove fraud. He'd said people in relationships made mistakes with money all the time without criminal intent. He'd said Natalie had been planning to marry me and that leaving before the wedding was simply cold feet rather than evidence of a scam. Judith had systematically destroyed each argument with evidence showing the pattern across multiple victims: the fake employment, the fake accounts, the attempted theft, and the disappearance with my property. The judge had denied bail and set a trial date for 3 months later. Walking out of the courthouse, I'd been approached by a reporter who'd been covering the case. She'd asked for an interview, and I'd declined. Diana had said media attention could complicate the trial, and it was better to stay quiet until after the verdict. The reporter had said other victims had started coming forward after seeing news coverage of Natalie. She'd said there might be as many as 8 or 9 men across different states who'd been targeted by Natalie over the past 7 years. The scope of her operation was larger than even the private investigator had discovered. The trial 3 months later had taken 2 weeks. I testified for an entire day, walking through how Natalie and I had met, how the relationship had developed, how she'd gained my trust, how she'd positioned herself to access my inheritance. I'd described finding Garrett's folder and realizing everything had been lies. I'd explained the missing money, the fake accounts, the stolen property. Natalie's attorney had tried to portray me as a paranoid rich person who'd gotten cold feet and was now trying to punish an innocent woman, but the evidence had been overwhelming. Philip and David had testified about their experiences. 3 other victims who'd come forward after the arrest.
I don't have anywhere to go.
The pattern was undeniable.
Like, I genuinely don't have anywhere.
Wealthy single men, gaining their trust through an elaborate false identity, rushing them toward marriage, stealing what she could.
I don't have anything.
The prosecutor had introduced evidence that Natalie had been researching my financial situation online for months before we'd ever met, showing premeditation and a plan. She'd known about my startup sale before approaching me at the coffee shop where we'd supposedly met by chance. The defense had called Natalie to testify in her defense. She'd cried on the stand, claiming she genuinely loved me and had made mistakes with money but never intended fraud. She'd said her difficult childhood had given her trust issues around finances, and she'd been trying to protect herself. She'd said leaving before the wedding had been panic about commitment, not escape after theft. Judith's cross-examination had been brutal, walking Natalie through each.
Okay, no. No! Clipped. Oh my god! No! No! Oh my god! No! No! I'm not that stupid! No! Oh my god! Oh, I got his chest plate! Oh my god! What the freak? No! I'm not... Oh my god! I'm keep escaping! I have like a...